So it's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate actually the talks that I heard yesterday and the discussions and so forth. It takes a lot of work to bring different kinds of people and communities together, and I think it's very important to carry the research forward. What I'm going to be talking about today is a lot. I'm not sure I'll be able to cover everything. The talk will be posted. I'm interested in giving you highlights of some of our research over the past couple of years, and probably to engage you in maybe collaborative activities and other kinds of activities. Now, I'd like to thank the organizers, because without their hard work, we wouldn't all be here. And also, I appreciate all the work that I've done over the years with my students and collaborators. Now, this is kind of the organization of the presentation I'm giving you today. I'll give you background and motivation, and I'll try and relate it to the talks that we heard yesterday. But obviously, this presentation was prepared way before the talks, the other talks. I'll be talking about why behavior matters in network design. And indeed, my principal love is transportation and logistics. So a lot of the applications that I'll be discussing here, they're in the context of supply chain networks, but I'll be presenting them kind of in the prism of transportation. Because in my opinion, if you can handle complex transportation systems, many other network systems are actually fairly simple. Doesn't matter. Okay, also, I'll be talking a little bit about the methodologies that we're using, just at a high level. You can read about them in my books and papers and so forth and others. I'll also be talking, and I think this is really important, I believe in not only doing the theory and kind of driving the methodological developments, but I think it's important to apply our work and our theories to concrete examples. So I'll be talking about a very large-scale model and application that we did. It was the first of its kind to model the entire electric power supply chain of New England. So it's a very large-scale application. Also, I'll be talking about some challenging problems, and the kind of perspective I have for network design is as follows. You can think about adding a link, you can think about adding a node, you can think about maybe merging different kinds of network systems. You can also think about designing networks from scratch, or you can think about redesigning networks as demands change and so forth. Maybe you want to expand some capacities and say decrease capacities. So I'll be talking about a challenging network design problem in the case of what we call critical needs products. Those are the kinds of products that you might need in the case of epidemics or different kinds of disasters. So if you need to kind of produce medicines quickly, vaccines quickly, there still could be a lot of uncertainty. So how are we handling those kinds of problems? Also, I'll be talking about how we've extended that work to the case of perishable product supply chains. It's amazing how many different products actually perish as they move through the network. For example, fruits and vegetables, by the time they arrive, say from Africa or South America or even the US to Europe, they might not be in as good a quality or the same kind of form as when they were originally produced. We also talk about a lot of our applications to healthcare in terms of perishable supply chains. And here you'll see that behavior really matters. Do we want to optimize the whole network in kind of a system optimized perspective, or do we have competition? And for example, I'll be finishing up with some work in pharmaceutical supply chains, where you have different drug companies. This is really interesting because you have some major ones in Europe, some major ones in the US, and they're competing. And their drugs or their medicines are slightly differentiated. So how do we handle those kinds of oligopolistic supply chain network problems? And also, a lot of the drugs will perish. Okay? They have expiration dates and so forth. So these are just kind of some of the high points. So background and motivation. I believe that supply chain networks are the critical infrastructure in networks because they provide kind of the backbones for the production and distribution of goods and also services in our network economy. So typically when you think of supply chains, you think of manufacturers producing goods. You think of suppliers also putting inputs into the production processes. Then you have transportation service providers having to ship the goods. You might have warehouses for storage. So these are very complex networks. And then ultimately, they need to be delivered to the retailers and the consumers of the demand markets. Okay? Now, underlying these supply chain networks are also multimodal transportation networks. So you might have different modes of transportation that you want to avail yourself. Should you ship by train? Should you ship by truck? And also, obviously, the internet is really, really important in supply chain networks because of e-commerce and orders and so forth. So this is a very general kind of supply chain. You can think of suppliers, different kinds of tiers. You have different manufacturers, and for example, the warehouses, the transportation modes, different, say, storage centers, and all the way to the stores, or maybe even to the homes. Okay, so our goal is to kind of model, depending upon the behavior, say the individual decision-making behavior, okay, whether it's profit maximization, cost minimization, and to see how they work. Because obviously, if you don't have cooperation between tiers through pricing, once the goods arrive at a warehouse, if you don't want to accept it, nothing's going to happen. You're not going to have a supply chain network. Okay? So in some instances, I'll be giving you applications where you might have a central controller who can control all these various activities. Okay? Almost think of like Walmart, for example, which I don't have here, and can make sure that everything gets delivered in a timely fashion. Or you might have, say, competitors across a tier of a supply chain network. Manufacturers can compete. Okay? You might think of ISP providers and so forth competing. Right? But you have to have a cooperation actually in between. And we're really interested in formulating these models and solving them so we can kind of map the flows that are flowing through. And sometimes you have transformational flows too, okay? Because what gets put in and manufactured might be different. Also, we're very interested in determining what are going to be the prices. Now, in terms of the demands, we might have fixed demand models, as we have in transportation, or we might have elastic demand models, kind of for longer horizon. But obviously, demand model matters, and we're interested in doing kind of the optimization, the economics, and in a sense, for the electric power supply chains, also the engineering. Okay, so these are just some examples of supply chains. We have food supply chains, complex. We have high-tech products. You might have inputs into your production processes produced, for example, somewhere in Asia, then assembled maybe on the European continent, maybe in the US, and then distributed all around the world. For example, automotive supply chains. We saw what happened after the Japan triple disaster on March 11, 2011, when we couldn't get the components. In the US, Ford Corporation couldn't produce certain cars because they didn't have the right paints. Because all the paints that they needed, for example, of a certain color, were produced in that region of Japan. So it's amazing how integrated the supply chains are. And if you have a disruption in a part of the world, that can really have propagating failures. And it's very important to be able to study these holistically. I'll be focusing also on energy supply chains, clothing and toys. We're in Paris, something clothing. Also healthcare supply chains. They have their own specific kinds of characteristics which are different. And that's why I think these problems are so fascinating. So many applications. In addition, the model later that I'm going to be discussing, it can be used and is starting to be used also in humanitarian relief. And here there's a great deal of uncertainty. And also what's really interesting, I think, congestion is a huge issue in humanitarian relief or humanitarian logistics kinds of networks. Because what happened, for example, after the Haiti earthquake, you had all these planes circulating and so forth, trying to bring the relief supplies, but the tarmac was filled. Okay, so they couldn't until they brought boats in and so forth. Okay, so that's a big problem. And also, as we were hearing yesterday, we're getting more and more ideas from biology. And actually, I'm working now, really interestingly, with the Frenchman, Professor Christian Milan, in applying our ideas in supply chains to ecological predator-prey networks. And the work that he's done in that application, we find exactly mimic like network economics behavior in supply chains. Okay? So we work on big fish versus little fish. Yesterday we heard about hawks and doves, and it's really, really interesting how a lot of these different science applications are kind of almost merging in terms of behavior. So I know in the literature you might see papers, for example, that talk about supply chains, and they'll say it's a multi-tier supply chain, and to us who work in networks, it'll just be a 2-node, 1-link network. They say, wait, that's not a supply chain, that's too simple. Okay, you're missing a lot. You can't just be capturing, the behavior on one link and 2 nodes interacting. You have to be able to study these networks as systems. Okay? And it's not just always system optimization. And that's why some have difficulty figuring out, well, what happens? Well, go into the real world and see what's happening, and then try and model it. I think that's really important. So, since supply chains are built on like transportation networks, also on telecommunication networks, they've assumed many of the kind of characteristics that networks have today. Years ago, we didn't worry about congestion. Right? Now congestion is a huge problem, but the first aspect is large scale. Many of these supply chains will have tens of thousands of demand points or hundreds of thousands of demand points. You might have numerous types of products that, say, a high-tech company wants to produce. So it's a large-scale network topology, very similar to actually transportation. Also, congestion is a huge issue here. It's an issue in terms of transportation and delivering the goods to the warehouses and to the demand points. It's an issue also, you have capacities at the various storage facilities, you even have capacities at stores. Okay? So congestion is very important, and we're definitely living in a nonlinear world. In addition, if you don't capture the user behavior and the behavior of the decision makers, we can have paradoxes, right? We can all really put it that. In addition, you have, say, networks now, it's really the era of like super networks, they interact. If something happens to electric power, your internet goes down, your financial networks go down, the transportation doesn't flow, okay, and so forth. So that's really important too. Moreover, as we'll be showing, we're also now recognizing more of the climate change, strange weather, etc., the fragility and vulnerability of our network systems. And I'll give you some data. And finally, when we make decisions concerning networks, it's very important because they could have political implications, societal implications, and so forth. Like, for example, which nuclear power plant do you shut down? Right? Where do you build the next nuclear power plant? You do. Where do you build the next bridge? And so on. Right? So it's very important to be able to analyze these supply chain networks as systems. Because if something goes wrong in one part of the world, it can have ramifications throughout, or in different parts of the world that you wouldn't even think about. At the other hand, if we can model supply chain networks, well, if there are new opportunities, we can exploit them. Maybe we have new demand markets. Maybe there are new products that we can bring. Maybe there are new roads that are being built that creates new kinds of opportunities and so forth. So my approach, thank you, Aitan, to supply chain network analysis done through a prism of different kinds of books that I've written. I'm very interested also in sustainability. That's another talk. Not much time to do that. But once you have some of the basic frameworks, you can expand upon them. Okay, so why user behavior must be captured in network design. Okay, because you have, for example, you have congestion, you have different interactions on these network systems. You have sometimes behavior which isn't very well organized, okay, selfish behavior, and so forth. And everyone here is familiar with decentralized behavior, which is the same as selfish, or user-optimized behavior, where individuals make their individual choices. And in transportation, you want to determine the optimal route of travel for yourself as an individual. You don't care the impact that you have on someone else. Okay? But obviously, whatever you do, that creates negative externalities to others because you're adding to the congestion. as opposed to, say, centralized behavior or system optimization, where you have a central controller can route the traffic in the network so that you minimize the total cost of the network, but still satisfy the demands. Okay? So different kinds of behavior, you get different types of flow patterns, except in very specialized kinds of networks, and that means for very specialized cost functions. So I was very happy that I didn't mention Wardrope. Okay, indeed, that's 1952, and Wardrope was a civil engineer. He's the one to whom we attribute two basic principles of travel behavior. And the first principle of travel behavior is called user optimization. And actually the term user optimization was coined by my thesis advisor, Stella DeFermos, and her thesis advisor. Okay? See the genealogy. So it was DeFermos and Sparrow in 1969 coined the terms user optimization and system optimization. User optimization corresponds to Wardrope's first principle of travel behavior. Okay, travelers choose their optimal routes of travel from an origin node to destination node until they can't improve upon their situation. So all used paths connecting an origin-destination pair of nodes have equal and minimal travel time. Because if you find out there's a cheaper path, right, you will keep on switching until you can't do any better. Right? So that gives you certain kinds of flow patterns as well as induced travel times or cost to go from the origin node to destination node, as opposed to system optimized behavior, where you have a single objective function. That's typically the total cost of the network, and you route the traffic so you minimize the total cost of the network, and you want to make sure that you satisfy the demand. You want to make sure all those travelers actually make it to the demand pool. I almost didn't make it here. We were in an accident from the airport. I didn't really trust the taxi driver, but anyway. And he kept on saying, when can I bring you back to the airport? And as we were arriving in Paris, this big truck hit us. Okay? So we don't like perishability. We want to make sure that we make it to our demand points. Okay? So here, okay, under certain assumptions, we have different formulations for user optimization. And what's wonderful about this and why these kinds of principles are applied, their companies formed and so forth, being used throughout the world, is that we can formulate these conditions mathematically. And under certain assumptions then, we solve them efficiently. So the user optimized conditions stated mathematically, we say that a flow on a path P at speed star is positive, so a path or route will be used in equilibrium if all used paths have equal and minimal travel time or travel cost. So capital CP is the cost, okay? Small p is the path. And they'd be all equal for, say, an origin-destination pair, okay? Say denoted by W. So travelers only use the minimal cost of travel, okay? And they learn over time. We have all sorts of dynamic kind of touch-on-all processes that mimic how drivers learn over time. As opposed to system optimized conditions, where you will have the optimality conditions holding when you have a positive flow on a path P if the marginal of the total costs on the path P are equal and minimal for all paths joining a particular origin destination pair of nodes W. So different conditions, and this is what's important. Who does not know the Bryce paradox? Okay, everyone here. God, oh, it's so nice. So this is the first Bryce network, right? You have a single origin node 1, a single destination node 4. You have these user link cost functions. They're congested, right? The greater the flow on a particular link A, the longer the travel time. Okay, you see kind of that the cost on link A is the same as the cost on link D. Likewise, B and C. Right? So if you have a demand of, say, 6 vehicles per unit time, and you assume user optimizing behavior, traffic will split. Right? We'll have 3 users per unit time using path P1, consisting of links A and C, 3 users using path P2, consisting of links B and D. And when you sum up the incurred congestion, you'll see that the cost on path P1, which consists of, say, links A and C, will be, so it'll be 3 and 3, so it'll be 30 plus 53, 83. And likewise on the other path. Okay, so it takes you 83 minutes to get to work, whether you're using pack P1 or pack P2. If anyone switches, even a fractional switch, you'll have a higher cost, so that's the user-optimized flow pattern. So Bryce in 1968 decided, well, actually, and I'll tell you more about it, decided to add a particular link. By adding a link E, you create another alternative. And obviously planners then and network designers would think, you have another choice. It must be better for everyone because it gives you another choice, right? But the way this is designed, even though you have a new path, P3, consisting of links A, E, and D, you do not change the demand. Say that hasn't changed. You still have 6 vehicles per unit time. But the travel time for everyone goes up. The new user-optimized flow pattern is, rather than having 3 on path P1, 3 on path P2, you have 2 vehicles per unit time on each of the paths. Okay, it sums up to the demand of 6, but the travel time has gone up from, say, like 83 minutes without the new link to 92 minutes. And that's for everyone in the network. Okay, so this is the very famous Bryce paradox, which Bryce published actually in 1968, and the paper was written in German. And Eitman was talking about all these scientists rediscovering, and obviously we didn't have an internet in 1968 and so forth. He actually went to a talk of a Professor Cole, and then went back and said, wait a minute, I really believe there's something like user optimization. And essentially in his 1968 paper, not only did he discover this Bryce paradox, or paradox that's named after him, but he also rediscovered user optimization and system optimization, Wardrop's 2 principles. He didn't even really know, which is kind of amazing. And a few years ago, this is Professor Bryce. He approached us because so many computer scientists were fascinated by this paradox and also the paper. Not everyone knows German. So he said, could we possibly translate the paper from German to English so it would be open to a wider audience? So we did, and actually it was very convenient because I had a student from Austria then, Tina Waffel-England, who's now a professor in Vienna. Okay, she became full professor in 3 years, which is unheard of. We translated the article, and it was actually a featured article in Transportation Science, which is the top transportation journal. And also we wrote an article explaining like where he got the ideas from and so forth, and giving the context of why this translation made sense. And so forth. He's become quite a great friend. Now, what about Bryce paradox around work? As something that fascinates people. For example, one of the first examples is in Stuttgart, where they had built a new road downtown in 1969, and travel time has actually worsened, so they got rid of the road. Okay? And travel time improved. Also, a very famous example, Earth Day, very appropriate, in New York City in 1990, they closed 42nd Street. Okay? And the director of transportation in New York City then had a PhD in civil engineering. And he even knew about the Bryce paradox. I think that's fantastic. Okay, so they closed it and people didn't complain. They were kind of, wow, actually traffic is flowing quite well. Very famous example. This was a big, big project in Seoul, Korea in 2002. This was a 6-lane highway, huge. They actually dug it up. They'd done a lot of transportation analysis before that to kind of recover kind of the original river that had been there and planted greenery, and travel times also improved. Okay, and also so better for the environment too, right? Okay, and traffic. So that's kind of the reverse of Bryce paradox. Sometimes you might be better off by just getting rid of a road, which a lot of people pull out their phone and say, how can that possibly happen? Now, this was really interesting. In May 2009, the mayor of New York City is quite, he's really data-driven. He loves analysis, not only financial, but even engineering. And they were doing some studies. They didn't do them so well. But he decided, let's close certain roads. Okay? And so he closed Broadway in New York City from 47th Street to 42nd Street. And created a pedestrian plaza, more like what we have in Europe and so on. He also did some changes close to 34th Street, but that hasn't been so successful. And if you look, for example, at the topology, you could think of it as being like the Bryce network almost, in terms of the configuration. And so we have Bryce on Broadway. Now, where does that get you? Well, last year, March 15th, I got contacted. This way, this work, you never know who's going to contact you. I was at the World Science Festival in New York City talking about traffic after the Bryce actually got rid of Broadway to vehicles. And you probably don't know who this is. I didn't know who it was either. In America, we have this magazine, People magazine. I don't know what your favorite Parisian magazine is. But we have this big television show called Survivor, and he won one of those competitions in Cook Islands, $1.5 million. So this is for a television program, public broadcasting. It's going to be televised in February. It's going to be on the infrastructure in the U.S. on transportation, energy, and food, which will be fascinating. This is Yul Kwon. He has degrees from Yale and Stanford. He's taken courses in game theory. Okay? And he's saying because of actually his courses in game theory, he thinks that's why he won the Survivor. Okay, $1.5 million. So this was, they wanted to film us, okay, on Broadway, which they did. It was freezing. It was about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. They said, just wear a suit. I said, he was shivering. Okay, 4 hours and so forth. But it was fascinating. So we were talking about Bryce and so forth, and for a general audience. So it'll be interesting to see how it actually comes out. Okay? So we know that in the case of system optimization, if you add a link, worse it won't be used, so it can never hurt the total cost of the network. So it's really, really important to capture behavior. Okay? Is it SO? Is it user optimized? And so forth. So what are the methodologies that we use? Beckman, McGuire, and Winston, their classical book, Studies in the Economics of Transportation, published in 1956, realized that under certain symmetry assumptions, on those user link cost functions, okay, for example, if the cost on the link depends only on the flow on the link, you could reformulate those network equilibrium conditions as an associated optimization problem. They would just coincide with the Kuhn-Tucker conditions. But if you have, for example, different classes of users who perceive travel time or travel costs in a different way, or you have different modes of transportation, for example, that truck that hit our taxi with the glass shattering, I'm like, is this really happening to me? There's obviously an unequal balance. There are asymmetries in the interactors. So how we formulate and solve more general user-optimized problems is using variational inequality theory. Okay? Those conditions which I gave you could be formulated in a very elegant way in terms of path flows or link flows as a single finite dimensional variation equality problem. All we have to do is determine, say, the vector x star. That'll be the same path flow pattern, the equilibrium path flow pattern, such that this inner product holds. And the vector f would consist then of the vector of the path costs on the various lengths. And this feasible set K here is, for example, the conservation of flow equation. So this is a variation equality problem. And it's a single inequality. So even though you might have tens of thousands of paths or routes choices, you could formulate those governing equilibrium conditions as a single variation equality. So it's a very elegant, compact formulation. Moreover, it contains the special cases, many of the classical kind of math programming problems, for example, optimization problems, complementarity problems, and it's also related to the fixed point problem. Okay, however, we're interested, as we're here too, not only in studying, say, equilibrium states and computing equilibrium states and doing sensitivity analysis and stability analysis, we are also interested in seeing how, say, travelers or even products, those who manipulate those supply chains, how they evolve over time to various equilibrium states. So actually, when I was on sabbatical at Brown University, Paul Dupuy and I developed a new kind of dynamical system. Okay, those of us in operations research, we're always dealing with constraints. Okay? Either demand constraints or time constraints, budget constraints, financial constraints, human resource constraints. But it seems in dynamical systems, it's just typically x dot equals minus f of x. And I'm like, where are the constraints? So we had actually thought that the dynamical systems people at the Lakewood Center for Dynamical Systems had developed these kinds of systems, but they hadn't. So we developed the whole theory, and then later with one of my former doctoral students, Jane, we wrote a book on projected dynamical systems and variational inequalities. So any kind of variational equality that has certain features, like the set is closed, feasible set is closed and convex, and needs some continuity properties and so forth. The variational equality has a natural underlying dynamical system, and it's a projected dynamical system. Because that right-hand side is going to be discontinuous. Because you have to make sure that the constraints are always satisfied. So you're going to have to always project back. Okay? So when you have the solution to the variational equality, essentially you have the vector x minus f star has to have an angle less than 90 degrees. We're talking about orthogonal vectors yesterday and so forth. And the dynamical system, you can have the trajectory. Say you begin with some x0 satisfying the constraints. It'll show you how you actually reach the equilibrium. We have all sorts of stability results and so forth. But just to let you know that we're not just interested in equilibria, we're also interested in the underlying dynamics. Okay? And actually this methodology, as we were talking yesterday, we're talking about biology, a little bit about psychology, engineering, economics, and so forth. Now, projected dynamical systems, which we've developed, have been used in different disciplines, okay, the methodology. So I'm very interested in applications, and then if you can't solve them, you have to develop the right methodologies, or else you can't move forward. So Bill Sandholm, some of you might be aware of his work in population games and evolutionary game theory. Actually, he wrote a book, MIT Press, on evolutionary population games, just published fairly recently, and he uses our theory, okay, projected dynamical systems. But interestingly, he assumes kind of the population is always one, and I do believe you need to vary the demands because you get different answers and so forth. But still, it's really nice to have economists using your work and problems they could not solve before you develop the methodology. Okay. Moreover, we're doing a lot of work fascinated by predator-prey networks. So we develop projected dynamical systems for these multi-tiered predator-prey models. Okay? Someone's eating someone else and so forth. That's like a supply chain. Okay? And they behave exactly like in an economics way, which is fascinating. It sounds like supply functions, demand functions. So you try and map them, and one of the leaders of this area is Professor Christian Milan, to figure out where the species will be located, for example, in the ocean. And we use real data, okay, which is really, really neat. You see it working. And in addition, we realize that some of our work is now even being used, okay, to model the brain networks. And something fascinating, which you might be really interested in, we've been approached by medical scientists and doctors saying that targeted cancer therapies kind of behave like the Bryce paradox. You think it should be working, but actually it's not working. Okay? So they're thinking of applying those ideas. They've started, actually, which I think is fascinating. Okay, what was brilliant about Bryce's work is that he figured out exactly the demand. Okay, 6. Okay? So you might ask, right? What happens if the demand changes, right? Because sometimes demand is lower over the day. Right? Maybe in the middle of the night, there's not much traffic in Paris. Maybe there's always traffic in Paris. But the demand varies. Okay, so for example, we were interested in studying what happens if the demand is low, what happens if the demand is high. Now, in 1997, Haas and Principio studies asking these questions, but we were able to model, for example, time-varying demands and see what happens to the equilibrium pattern in the Bryce network as an evolutionary variational equality. So it's an infinite dimensional variational equality. Going back to like the work of Leons and Stepakia and others. And I don't know how many of you have seen this, but if the demand is fairly low on that Bryce network, okay, only that new route is used. So the original 2 rows aren't used. Okay, and the paradox doesn't occur. Okay, everyone uses the new road, travel time goes down. So that's a good decision, right? Then in a certain range, it's just around 3, up to 8 and 8/9 vehicles per unit time, you have the addition of that road actually makes travel time or user travel costs worse for everyone in the network. And notice Bryce was brilliant because it's 6 here. Okay, right in the range. And this is what really gets me. Usually they say, build, right? Build your network infrastructure and they will come. Okay, right? And they will come. Okay, what if the demand keeps on increasing after 8 and 8/9? That new road isn't used anymore under user-optimized behavior. So this really tells like network designers, you better be thinking before you build because maybe it just doesn't make sense, okay, under user optimization. Okay? And in this range of the demand, travel time, there's no Bryce paradox. You have the original flow pattern. Okay? Just those outside roads are used. Okay? So the Bryce paradox only occurs in a certain level, okay, range of travel demand for that, which to me is fascinating. Now, other networks which behave like the congested urban transportation networks. The internet, you're probably aware of the famous paper by Corellis, Lazar, and Florida, I think it's Annals of Probability, where they studied the internet as a decentralized network and show that the Bryce paradox can occur there. And also electric power networks. A recent study at Carnegie Mellon University showed that Bryce paradox can also occur and such. So both of these networks actually operate as decentralized kinds of networks. So let me tell you a little bit about our work on electric power supply chains. Yesterday we heard Professor Bashar talking about smart grids. Indeed, it's very fashionable now in the US, but also we're so dependent on energy. It's so important, especially now with so many changes in the energy industry. And in the US, we're undergoing deregulation, all sorts of trying to switch to renewables and so on. So we developed, this was a real challenge with one of my former doctoral students, who's now a professor, a long paper published in Naval Research Logistics. Okay, we were interested in modeling all of New England. And one of the reasons it's interesting is, well, first of all, I live there, so it's interesting to us. Also, we have extremes. We have horrible winters, lots of snow. Summers can be very, very hot, and so we have a lot of variability. And also, many of the transmission lines are getting very congested. For example, in Connecticut and so on, so we thought it'd be really interesting to see what's happened. And to look at different kinds of fuel supplies and so forth, see what would happen. So this model captures both engineering aspects and economic aspects. Okay, that's important. We have the different regions of New England, okay, and some of the states are actually broken up. And it's the first model of its kind. And we captured all of the generating units, all the different fuel markets. Okay, we have residual oil, we have natural gas, we have coal and so forth. And we were interested in integrating the fuel market, so it's the supply part too, and the full supply chain. Okay? We also were able to get the data, because very close to Amherst, we have something known as an independent system operator that monitors the reliability of the electric power grid for all of New England. And when there have been various power outages, actually, they're very, very good. They have hundreds of PhDs, okay, working on this, very high-tech, screens and so forth. And this is kind of the network representation. And we had various demand markets, which we grouped in different kinds of regions. We have all the transmissions, we have the providers, the fuel markets, and we captured the individual behavior. Okay, so across the tier, there will be, for example, competition, but you have to have cooperation. And what's neat about electric power, you don't have any inventory. Okay? Most of it's produced, it's supposed to. And we were able to get a lot of the data directly from the website, the flow data and also the pricing data. And we were interested in studying a period where it was very, very hot. And that was actually July 2006. It was one of the hottest months we'd ever had. And we would break up actually the demand data for the entire month. So it'd be hourly data, and we had the price data and so forth. The problem had over 20,000 variables. We formulated it. I didn't want to give you the formulation, even though it's a single inequality. It's a pretty long variation inequality, because you have to capture the behavior of all the decision makers in the electric power supply chain. And kind of the proof that it worked well, here you have the actual prices of electric power at the various demand points, and our simulated prices were almost perfect. And actually ISO, they were kind of amazed that we could actually do that and replicate it. And you can do all sorts of sensitivity analysis now. You can play around with the various inputs, what's going to happen if the oil price increases, what happens if the natural gas price increases and so forth, what if you build new lines and so on. So we do all sorts of sensitivity analysis. What is kind of the price of electric power, if the residual fuel oil prices change, if the natural gas prices change, and so on. So it's kind of a wonderful test bed. Okay, we're also very interested in analyzing now emissions. Okay, so sensitivity analysis. So these are just a little bit of the framework. Okay, we showed how if you add a certain link, if you don't capture the behavior, you might get paradoxes. We talked about, this is kind of capturing an entire electric power supply chain, modeling it from scratch. I'd like to talk a little bit about what happens if you join networks. And that's something really interesting. And then I'll discuss designing a network from scratch for critical needs. So what about mergers and acquisitions? It's kind of a financial topic, but I think there's a lot of network interest here. I tend to look at firms and organizations as networks. Okay. So here, for example, even with our economic crisis, things are starting to turn around a bit, and there are like bigger companies swallowing little companies. You think of big fish swallowing little fish, and so on. And especially in certain industries, for example, we've had a lot of merger and acquisition activity, for example, in airline industries. Northwest has merged with Delta, United has merged with Continental, and there are really interesting issues happening because they have different routes and so forth, so when they merge you want to be able to identify any possible synergies. So what we're doing, actually, we have a whole big, actually a slew of papers to identify a priori the possible synergy associated with a merger or an acquisition. And when you talk about airline industries, kind of pharmaceutical companies also are merging, and financial services companies too. And there are lots of challenges in financial services. So this was the first paper that kind of talked about synergy measures associated with mergers and acquisitions. You think about two firms, and you can think of these as supply chains themselves. Say you have like manufacturing links, then transportation links, you have certain storage facilities, and say demand points that you want to satisfy. Say your consumers at the demand markets, and say they're totally different. Okay, so you have a firm A, you have a firm B, and each is optimized. And you think of what happens if they merge. How do you capture that? You can think of it as being like a new firm. So top there, and you have certain costs you can have associated with merging. There could be insurance costs and the legal fees, all sorts of things. And then, but then you can use the other kinds of distribution centers, say for example, maybe transportation facilities. You think about different levels of integration. And to figure out whether it makes sense, you can think about the total cost separately. Okay, the total costs associated with the merger, and then see what kind of synergies there are before you actually invest, okay, and purchase other companies or integrate. That was really, really interesting. We can also think about these in terms of humanitarian logistics. In terms of disasters, for example, you have different organizations. You might have the World Food Program, you might have the Red Cross and so forth. And it's amazing, but in a lot of these disaster kind of situations, you actually have competition among the various decision makers, which is really not good. Okay? So they really should be cooperating more and thinking about system optimization. And using these kinds of kind of network frameworks, you can figure out who should be working with whom. And then to your stakeholders, you can say, aha, this is how much it costs you. Okay? So if you give us this kind of money, okay, this is what it costs, it's very transparent, it's very fair. Okay, but what about competition? We can also think about evaluating mergers and acquisitions in the case of competitive firms. Say they're serving the same kinds of demand markets. Okay? So these are like oligopolistic supply chains. You might want to know, well, with whom should I partner? Okay? So should I have a coalition? Should I have partner with several firms, or say 2 by 2 and so forth, and then figure out what are going to be the potential gains in terms of profits and associated costs. And amazingly, this is something, because I love paradoxes, there's also a paradox kind of analogous to the Bryce paradox, but in terms of mergers and acquisitions, the economists kind of. So, but the thing is, their models were so simple, kind of, and they're saying, for example, that you only have like gains associated with mergers if 80% or more of the firms in an industry merge. And that's kind of ridiculous, because you see a lot of it's 2 by 2 marriage, kind of firm buys up another firm and so forth and so on. So we were able to show that, no, it doesn't have to be like that if you capture the whole network. The models were really simplistic. We could also think about networks with different kinds of flows. And this is something that I think is really, really challenging. We're doing a lot of work in super networks where we integrate, for example, social networks with supply chains and also social networks with financial networks. Because obviously if you know, say, your customers, or if you know your bank, and the bank knows you more, then your transaction costs tend to go down. Because the stronger the relationship, right, then you should know each other better. Okay? So Canada didn't have the big banking crisis. They were more risk averse and so forth. In the US, we're still suffering. Okay, and that's something really, really interesting to see how things evolve. So we're using projected dynamical systems. Okay, let's see how am I doing. Follow the whoops. Okay, we also have a model for critical needs. Because we have the number of natural disasters is growing, as well as the number of people affected by disasters. And the goods aren't being delivered to the people in need. Okay, the food isn't arriving. Okay, water and medicine, and especially in the U.S., we kind of learned from our mistakes, but Hurricane Katrina is still being called one of the greatest American tragedies, because the response was so horrific. And you can see the conjunction. People were donating tuxedos, but the diabetics couldn't have refrigerators for the medicine. So it was really ironic. And also the Haiti earthquake and what happened in Japan. And I have colleagues who were in Japan shortly after the disaster, and they were saying, in their opinion, the situation was as bad almost as Haiti, which frankly shocked me. Okay, and their papers being written on that mismanagement. So, and also the flu epidemic. So we're really living in a fragile network world. And because I don't have much time to go, but we're working on designing, say, supply chain networks from scratch under different kinds of behavior. And when it comes to disasters, you really should look at it from a system optimization point of view, even though some of those NGOs might be competing with each other. Okay? At least like different countries and ruling bodies can say, okay, this is what it really costs. So for example, we have an organization that has a template of a supply chain network. And say you want to figure out how much you should produce of the critical needs product, where you should ship it to, where it should be stored, given that you have different demand points. Okay? And there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, even when it comes to epidemics and so forth. So we assume that we have certain probability density functions, certain distribution, because at least you have some data. You can have an idea of what the size of the population will be at various parts. Okay? Especially now with sensor networks and communication networks. So we have also outsourcing. because in certain situations you might have to outsource, right? And these you would typically have certain capacities. So we work on, say, designing these networks from scratch. Say you have 0 capacities, and we're interested in minimizing the total operational cost and also the total cost associated with constructing certain levels of capacity for the various manufacturing links, transportation links, storage links, so that the demand is met as close as possible. Okay? So I don't have time to go through this, but just to give you a little bit of mathematics. You have an objective function which captures the total cost of the network, operational cost, total cost, the second term of having a certain capacity UA added to the network. It could be from 0, you could have some initial. And also we have expected, say, shortages or, say, surpluses and penalties associated with the shortages and surpluses. In some applications, you want to make sure that you have those vaccines and medicines delivered as well as the water, so you don't want to have shortages. Okay, you penalize if you have shortages because you'll have loss of life. Okay, and another kind of situation, maybe if there's a surplus, you just don't want too many of the planes trying to land at the same time and so forth. You want to penalize that, but also creates problems. And we have certain conservation of flow equations. And we formulate these problems as a variable equality problem over the non-negative ordinate, so it makes it very easy to compute. Okay, we have path flow formulations, link flow formulations, and we're applying them to different kinds of applications. But what's also nice, let me show you how we solve these problems. We get closed form expressions. Okay, so we're using a general iterative scheme that we developed with Paul Dupuy for projected dynamical systems that kind of models the adjustment process, and it's a discrete time algorithm, an Euler type of algorithm. So at each step tau, you get explicit formula for the path flows in the supply chain network, also for the capacities UA, how much to build, okay, where, and we have certain Lagrange multipliers because you might have certain capacities already. Okay? And we can solve these problems. Okay? For example, you have initial template, okay? And you get the data, okay? You have the probability distributions, this is kind of designing a network from scratch, and it tells you, well, this link shouldn't be built at all. It's 0 capacity, 0 flow, so remove it. Okay? Remove that one too, and this is what the final supply chain looks like, topology. You have the flows, you have the size of the capacities, you have the expected demands, and so on. And then you can do all sorts of sensitivity analysis. You might say, okay, maybe this was done for vaccine production for a certain year, and you might have certain capacities already on the network. So let's say we have that, and then you want to, again, re-optimize, and you'll say, okay, just, so 2 others already exist, they have positive flow, and another one doesn't, and that becomes the new network topology. And then we could change, say, the probability density function for probability distribution functions and see what happens. Okay, because we're running out of time. Okay, other applications are in healthcare, perishability, blood supply chains. We have 2 papers. This is also, there's uncertainty at the demand points, okay, especially in terms of disaster. So we've done work with the Red Cross, and it's a more complicated supply chain because you have to have testing and you have mobile units, so there's more uncertainty there. And other kinds of applications, okay, these are some of our to healthcare and medical kinds of applications, okay, including to perishable product oligopolies, okay, where we also capture the medical waste. But these will be networks where the flow kind of changes. And competitive networks too, oligopolies, in terms of perishable products. You see, there's just so much to do where, say, consumers can distinguish amongst the different products. So you have product differentiation. Maybe there's a brand drug that I really like. Okay, should I use the brand drug or the generic? And in the US, many of the patent rights are expiring for some of the biggest sellers, like tour, cholesterol. So what's going to be happening in the industry in the next couple of years is going to be really very interesting. Okay, so I'm running out of time. I'm trying to give you kind of a big picture of all sorts of exciting problems operating under different kind of behavior. Also a more specific kind of example. And there's still a lot to be done. Okay? I think some of the most fascinating problems are these complex supply chain networks. Other kind of work that we're doing, that's why I always tell my students, you need to learn your probability. You need to take a lot of those science engineering courses because you never know what you're going to use. So I'm working with physicists now on medical nuclear supply chains. Okay? Because for a lot of the diagnostics and so forth for cardiac problems, cancer problems in the US, we have no production facilities, we have no processing facilities. Okay, for example, for molybdenum. And this is kind of a hazardous product, but it's extremely important. Tens of thousands of these diagnostic procedures are done on an annual basis. But these nuclear power generators, okay, they're being shut down. The one that the US uses primarily is based in Canada. It's over 50 years old. So we're using these generalized network models to show the time decay of the product over. So that's really interesting work. So also, if you have these kinds of models, you can study disruptions and failures. And we put a lot of our work on our Super Network Center website. And actually, this presentation might even be up there so you can look at it in more detail. So I thank you. I don't want to go over, so I apologize.